guys, Summon of Responsibility Darkness Operations, which I believe is what Call of Duty Black Ops is called in Canada.
Given my track record of looking at platformers and horror games, you'd think that first-person shooters wouldn't be something that I'm very interested in, but assuming you haven't been here for some time, then you probably know that I'm a pretty big fan of Doom. But honestly, it's not just Doom that I like in terms of first-person shooters. Halo, Fear, Condemned, all FPS games that I've enjoyed playing in the past and still do to this day. And while the Call of Duty series might seem like an odd choice for me given what I review, it's not as if I hate the series like so many others who claim that the Call of Duty franchise is bland, stale, and repetitive. Funny, considering that the kinds of people who use that kind of criticism against Call of Duty also happen to love games that are bland, stale, and repetitive.
And of course, before any of you Nintendo dorks decide to come after me, I have just one thing to say. You just can't handle my totally radical 90s insults, dude.
Anyway, without any real development history to speak of, on November 9th, 2010, Call of Duty Black Ops was declassified to the public.
And so, let's answer the Call of Duty.
So the plot kicks off with Soldier Alex Mason being held in an interrogation room, being questioned about something to do with numbers, a man named Dragovich, and a broadcast station.
And as you can imagine, Alex is not too pleased about this.
What's your name?
Fuck you!
Where were you born?
Kiss my ass!
With both parties getting seemingly nowhere, Mason's interrogator decides to start off at the very beginning. More specifically, on April 17th, 1961, during Operation 40 in the Bay of Pigs, where Mason, alongside his teammates Frank Woods and Joseph Ice Cube Bowman, are sent in to assassinate Fidel Castro.
But for those of you who know your real-world history, I'm pretty sure it's quite clear that the trio had failed in their task to assassinate Castro, given that the man's actual death wouldn't be until 2016.
Surprise, surprise, Castro, as it turns out, had a body double, and during the evacuation, Mason manages to get Woods and Ice Cube out of there at the cost of staying behind to ensure their safety on the plane. Upon being captured, Mason meets the real Fidel Castro, who was then seen talking with two Russians beside a ship called the Rizalka. And as a gift of good faith on Castro's part, he gives his new Russian friends Alex Mason, who appears to be integral to the Russians' plans. Back in the interrogation room, Alex explains that the Russian who captured him was a man named Nikita Dragovich, who had taken him to a Russian labor camp called Vorkuta. 2 years later, and during his incarceration, Mason has befriended one Viktor Reznov, a character that most fans would probably recognize from Call of Duty World at War. And like all good friends, Reznov and Mason inspire an uprising and riot to escape from Vorkuta. And given Reznov's unbreakable resolve, I don't think it's really that hard to see why Mason holds such a great respect for him.
We will not pause! We will not falter! We will be free! Or die trying! We will not pause!
I believe...
After much struggle and perseverance, Mason and Reznov acquire some motorcycles and are headed straight for the train line that is the key to their freedom from Vorkuta. When making the jump for the train, however, Mason makes the leap, but Reznov sacrifices himself for Alex's freedom. Jumping forward to November 10th, 1963, Mason returns to US soil to be sent to briefing at the Pentagon, where we meet Mason's new handler, a CIA agent named Jason Hudson, codenamed Mr. Shades, and a dude so badass that he wears sunglasses in the middle of the night.
Not that I would know anything about that, of course, I mean...
During our travels, we learned that the main antagonist of the game is the very same dude who was responsible for shoving Mason into Vorkuta.
This is Nikita Dragovich.
Only adding to that paranoia is that Mason's interrogator mentions that he was in the Pentagon with Mason at the time, always watching him. Descending into the inner sanctum, Mason is briefed by none other than the President of the United States himself.
We are in grave danger from the communists. Our freedom, our very way of life is at risk.
Whoa, okay. What am I playing, Call of Duty or First Encounter Assault Recon?
Anyway, Mason's next mission is for him, alongside Woods and Ice Cube, to rescue Grigory Weaver, a spy who infiltrated and sabotaged the Ascension Project, which was a part of the USSR's attempts to win the space race. Unfortunately for the team, however, Weaver's been compromised and is being held by Dragovich's second-in-command, Kravchenko. And if that wasn't bad enough, Weaver finds out just how cool it is to be Big Boss. The trio infiltrate the facility and rescue Weaver, but arrive too late to sabotage the launch of the Soyuz 2, leading to Mason destroying the rocket with a missile launcher. But even with small victories such as that, Dragovich and Kravchenko escape, leading to the next 5 years dedicated to hunting them down. Back in the present, Mason begins to suffer paranoid delusions as his thoughts are interrupted by Russian voices, with the interrogators now clarifying that the only thing that they want from Mason are the numbers inside his head.
Of course, what Mason doesn't know is that what the interrogators really want is tonight's winning lotto numbers.
The next mission sees us in Vietnam in 1968, where we get our Apocalypse Now references. with Mr. Shades tagging along Mason and Woods as they're briefed upon the mission in the caisson right before their jeep is attacked by Vietnamese forces, with Mr. Shades knocked unconscious. It's from the interrogator that we learn that Mason's mission was purely just to get to Hue City, but instead he decided to help defend the caisson.
And for those of you who are familiar with the Vietnam War, it's around this point in the game where you start to see some pretty gruesome shit.
Yeah, even despite most critics of the Call of Duty franchise who think the series is nothing more than online multiplayer and 12-year-old kiddie winks, you do have to remember that this series is about, war, and seeing Vietnam soldiers immolated in fire by flamethrowers and napalm strikes definitely does its job in making these conflicts a little bit more than unsettling. After defending the caisson, Mason and his team make their way to Hue City, where a Russian defector has information on Dragovich.
Or maybe the Russian defector was dead all along.
I joke, but apparently according to the interrogators, the Russian defector was killed during the attack on the MACV-SOG, while Mason counter-argues that he refused to believe that the defector was killed. Upon breaching the building where the defector is believed to be located, he turns out to be none other than Viktor Reznov. Reznov exposits that Dragovich is plotting an attack on the West, and that it's up to Mason to stop him, and going on to add that Dragovich, Kravchenko, and somebody named Steiner all must die. Mason then regroups with Woods and Ice Cube, introducing Reznov to them. But notice that neither Woods nor Ice Cube seem to acknowledge Reznov's existence. After evacuating Hue City, we learned that Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner were all involved in a project called Nova 6, leading to a protagonist switch where we switch up from Mason to Mr. Shades. Mr. Shades and Weaver were sent into Kowloon to investigate Dr. Clark, a communist associate who helped in the development of the Nova 6 project, and as a result of his knowledge is being hunted down by not only the US, but also by Dragovich's forces. All Clark can tell Mr. Shades is that Nova 6 was a chemical bioweapon before the trio were attacked by the Spetsnaz. While escaping, the only other pieces of information Clark can give Mr. Shades is that Steiner is located in Russia in the Yamantau Mountains, and that the numbers are integral to Dragovich's plan.
They're the key to Brazil!
Meanwhile, back with Mason, we learn that Nova 6 goes as far back as the Second World War, as he recollects a story that Reznov had told him in Vorkuta about what Dragovich had done to him in 1945 to test the weapon's capabilities. In this segment, we take control of Reznov, as we see Dragovich and Kravchenko hold little in the way of their allegiance to Russia, but more so in the pursuit of their own interests despite having communist ideals, as they collaborate with the Nazi scientist Friedrich Steiner. In Dragovich's little mission to meet up with Steiner, World at War players will be happy to see the return of Dmitry Petrenko, alongside references to the Battle of Berlin.
Wait, hang on a second. Returning character, and the fact that this game is centered around war. I'm sure Dimitri's gonna be just fine.
After finding Steiner and travelling down a dilapidated warship, Steiner exposits that the Nazis were looking towards chemical weapons as their means of finding a weapon capable of defeating the Allied forces. That weapon being Nova 6. Steiner continues to explain that the battleship was meant as a launching station for V-2 rockets, with their intended targets being Washington DC and Moscow, only stopped after British forces had bombed the vessel to pieces, and thus Germany losing their prized weapon. Upon finding the Nova 6, Dragovich decides to take this opportunity to dispose of Reznov and Dmitry, people who had long since held a distrust of his opportunist demeanour.
And for those of you who are fans of Dmitry Petrenko, it is probably for the best that you turn away right now.
He should have died in Berlin.
Only adding to Reznov's grief was the fact that the British forces had arrived and were likely seeking Nova 6 as well. In the interest of ensuring that the British forces never get their hands on Nova 6, Reznov destroys the vessel, setting Dragovich's plans back, but ultimately this led him to be incarcerated in Vorkuta. Concluding his story to Mason, Reznov speaks about what are essentially the game's arc words here.
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner. These men must die.
Back in the present, Mason, Woods, and Reznov make their way towards the Viet Cong forces, knowing that Kravchenko was waiting inside his compound. While clearing out a tunnel full of Viet Cong soldiers, a random soldier who goes by the name of Swift seems to have a rather bizarre reaction to Mason talking to Reznov.
What the fuck's wrong with you? Mason, you gotta keep your shit.
Oh no, not Swift! Whoever he was.
Mason and Reznov make it into Kravchenko's little Batcave and find Dr. Clark's notes regarding the testing of Nova 6. Outside of its nerve toxin effects that we'd already seen in action with Dmitry, the Nova 6 was also tested on a small population, with the test subjects being taken to Rebirth Island for further study. Meanwhile, back in the interrogation room, Mason is told by his captors that Reznov is not to be trusted, and he's not quite who Mason thinks he is. And it's also here where things are starting to come together, where the interrogator claims that Alex has been brainwashed, only further taking things down the rabbit hole is our next mission, where a Soviet plane carrying Nova 6 was shot down over Laos, with Mason and his team being sent in to retrieve it before the Soviets do. Upon reaching the wreckage, the trio find that the plane's been picked clean, and that the only place where Nova 6 could possibly be is in Kravchenko's compound in Laos. That, and just to piss on Mason's day even further, the Spetsnaz ambush Mason and his team is captured by Dragovich. Back in the interrogation room, the interrogator explains that because Mason's team was missing in action, Mr. Shades was sent in to deal with the Nova 6 threat. That, and the interrogator also lets slip that he was with Mr. Shades during the infiltration of Steiner's compound in the Yamantau Mountains. Unfortunately for Mr. Shades, however, Steiner is long gone and the facility is rigged to explode. Steiner then sends the team a communication that Dragovich is eliminating everybody that was involved in the Nova 6 project, with him being the next target on the list. On top of that, Dragovich also has sleeper cells that infiltrated the US who will release the Nova 6 gas all across the country. Steiner concludes his little spiel by saying that he's the only one who could possibly stop Dragovich from launching his attack, and that he has the codes necessary to prevent the numbers broadcast to give his sleeper agents the signal to attack.
And considering where Mason is in the present tense, I think we all know where this is headed.
Meanwhile, back with Mason, after he was captured by the Viet Cong forces, he, Woods, and Ice Cube are being toyed with.
And it's around here where things begin to get a little dark, so to speak.
Bowman! Bowman!
And it's here where we get our loving little homage to the Deer Hunter.
You shoot, GR, you shoot! Fuck!
Mason and Woods bust out of the prison and make their way to hunt down Kravchenko and avenge the death of Ice Cube. While blasting their way through Kravchenko's inner command center, the main man himself gets the drop on Mason, kicking the shit out of him before Woods shanks him with a knife, only for Kravchenko to blow things out of proportion.
What?
In the aftermath of Woods' death, Reznov helps Mason to his feet as their next course of action is to hunt down Steiner on Rebirth Island. All of which is then repeated in the mantra,
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Stein, all must die.
By this point in the interrogation, Mason had gone rogue and went against orders to go to Rebirth Island, claiming that Reznov was with him every step of the way.
This is where our plot points begin to converge.
With Mr. Shades and Weaver, plus Mason and Reznov headed towards the same destination on Rebirth Island, the two managed to bust into the lab where Reznov goes apeshit.
My name is Victor Reznov, and I will have my revenge!
And if you were following all the clues laden throughout the plot,
Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, they all had to die.
We wanted Steiner alive! Why did you have to kill him?
Because the numbers were telling me to!
it's time to see this scene from the perspective of Mr. Shades.
As Weaver and Mr. Shades infiltrate the facility, they come to discover that it wasn't Victor Reznov who killed Steiner, but in fact it was none other than Alex Mason.
My name is Victor Reznov, and I will have my
Revenge! Mason, no!
And so, here we are. Victor Reznov never existed at all. Our interrogators, Jason Hudson and Grigory Weaver. And lastly, with Steiner dead, Mason is the only one who knows the location of the Numbers broadcast station. And overall, I think this actually does make for a pretty decent twist on the first time player. Anyway, back in the present, the door to the interrogation room opens to reveal Mr. Shays himself, releasing Mason from his bonds before he's knocked out cold in a single punch, destroying the main menu. What follows from this point on is by far one of my favourite sequences of the game, where Mason trips out as the revelations to what happened to him with Vorkuta truly begin to unveil. It's also here where we learn that Dragovich and Steiner had pulled a Gerald Robotnik on Mason by reprogramming his mind to obey only their orders. However, Mason appears in some way resilient against Dragovich's commands.
And trust me, there is a very good reason for that, but before we dive in, here's a little bit of nightmare fuel. Sweet dreams, kiddies.
In all honesty though, this entire sequence to me puts some horror games to shame in terms of just how unsettling the atmosphere is. Mr. Shades eventually catches up with Mason, punching his lights out, and it's here where we find out that the reason why Mason was resistant against Dragovich's mental reprogramming was because Reznov had interfered and altered Mason's programming to carry out his revenge for what they did to him several years ago. So in essence, everything after Vorkuta involving Victor Reznov had never existed, with all that occurred only being carried out by Mason alone. However, now that Mason has become aware of what's going going on, Mr. Shades tells him that while he does have the numbers themselves, he needs Mason to translate them, as they had attempted to do by playing the numbers in his head over and over again.
Something you can actually hear during the gameplay if you listen carefully.
As it turns out, the location of the numbers broadcast station is the very ship we saw at the beginning of the game called the Rusalka, right where Castro handed over Mason to Dragovich.
So with all that said, what better time than now to put on some badass shades while some rockin' music plays.
Mason, Mr. Shades, and Weaver blast their way through the bows of the Rusalka to find their way down to the broadcast station beneath the ocean floor, which leads us to our final confrontation with Dragovich.
You tried to make me kill my own president!
Tried?
Oh really, Dragovich? Then let me tell you just one thing. The joke's on you.
With Dragovich dead and the broadcast station in ruins, Reznov congratulates Mason from inside his mind, claiming that he had finally fulfilled his promise of revenge.
Mason! It is over. We won.
A victorious scene immediately followed up with some stock footage of the Kennedy assassination, but of course with a twist. See, look, Mason really was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. See, look, you can see him somewhere in between the Ninth Doctor and the crew from Red Dwarf.
And that, my friends, was Call of Duty Black Ops. Honestly though, after seeing this game in action, my perspective of the Call of Duty series had radically shifted from what it once was.
Again, like most supposed hardcore gamers back in the day, I thought that the Call of Duty series was little more than
I am a soldier! My only interest in life are shooting guns! And I also like following orders! Semper Fi! Ah, fuck!
But Black Ops in particular gave me something that I didn't expect, which was its entire plot being a mix between a psychological thriller and a period piece on the Cold War. What really appealed to me about the main story of the game is more so how it used its settings to tell its story. Operations like the Tet Offensive, the Bay of Pigs, the Battle of Kaysan, and the Baikonur Cosmodrome are all events that occurred during the Cold War, and it certainly adds a sense of realism and grounded foundation to the narrative in a way in which games like Metal Gear do not. In addition, the ideas that it was toying with regarding Mason's psychological programming and the subtle way in which both Dragovich and Reznov had influenced them to carry out their goals, it also adds a nice little sense of horror to a series that many slag as being shallow war games. And while the horror isn't exactly Silent Hill here, it does do a pretty effective job in making the player feel unsettled. Particularly during the scenes of Dimitri's death by Nova 6 and when Mason breaks free of his programming. But all in all, Call of Duty Black Ops as a story overall left me pretty satisfied in terms of its narrative, and it's one that I think might just convince people that the Call of Duty series isn't all just kill the terrorists in terms of its story. Onto the gameplay side of things, being the first-person shooter that it is, your controls are generally adapted to the playstyle. You have R1 to shoot your guns, L1 to aim down the sights, L2 and R2 for flashbang and lethal grenades, and the R3 button to perform a melee attack. Alongside that, you can press the triangle button to switch through your primary and secondary weapon, square button to interact with specific items and objects, circle button to crouch and crawl, and the X button to jump. Simple controls to get accustomed to, and for their simplicity, the first time players should find themselves having an easy time getting to grips with how you control the player, regardless as to whether or not you're playing as Reznov, Mason, or Mr. Shades. Weapons, however, are where things get pretty diverse in terms of the technical aspects. While most of them follow the general line of pistols, machine guns, shotguns, grenade launchers, and so forth, the moment you pick up the weapons and start to use them during shootouts, you'll begin to pick up certain elements and the characteristics that each of them have. I'll admit, I'm no gun nut, so I'll probably get a lot of things wrong here when I describe things like this, but in a general sense, the most you really see a difference in are things about how the weapon's rate of fire is, how automatic weapons function compared to non-automatic weapons or semi-automatic, and how much ammo they can hold depending upon whether or not the weapon is modified or not, or whether or not specific weapons belong to different forces, like the Olympia shotgun versus the Spas 12 shotgun. A lot of this stuff is generally more applicable to the game's multiplayer mode, but overall, the guns do have their perks if you're a weapons expert and want to pick up a specific weapons combination.
And now that I mention it, one thing I would specifically like to mention in this review is that I will not be covering the multiplayer.
Heresy to some I know, since most people generally associate the word multiplayer with the name Call of Duty, but with me personally, here's the thing.
Now, don't get it twisted, I mean, I'm not saying that the multiplayer mode is bad or anything like that. I mean, hell, I can remember back in 2011, 2010, having more than my fair share of fun playing online deathmatches and having a jolly old good time, but honestly, and especially as I've gotten older, online gaming in general, as regards to multiplayer and everything, it's just become somewhat irrelevant to me.
But ultimately, it's not something I really care about in video games unless of course it's meant to be multiplayer focused in a game like Quake.
That and I couldn't find anybody with me to test out the split-screen multiplayer, mostly because I don't have any friends, so now I'll just have to live with the fact that I'm gonna die alone! Now, I did manage to capture some gameplay footage of the split-screen multiplayer mode thanks to the help of my good friend Reznov here, but unfortunately, the footage got corrupted, so we're not going to be able to see it. Real shame, don't you think, Reznov?
In terms of mission structure, your objectives are based upon the events in the story, and they are frequently updated on your screen, plus the already linear nature of the game will ensure that the first-time player shouldn't worry about getting lost on their first time through. As far as anything else in the main story to mention gameplay-wise, it'd be the occasional time you commandeer vehicles such as helicopters and boats. However, these moments are few and far between, so on the whole they're not too egregious to control. Well, except for maybe the hind choppers.
But if there is any other reason that I go back to Call of Duty Black Ops outside of the main story, it is for this one reason, and this is one of the most addicting parts of the game.
Zombies. If there was any other reason that I go back to Black Ops, 9 times out of 10, I'm usually playing through the Zombies mode. The game is set up in sort of an arcade-style version of the game, where you must survive wave after wave of zombies, and earn points by killing them in inventive scenarios. In terms of how the mode plays out, think Doom meets Kagero Deception 2. You can gain points by killing zombies, but you need to use those points in order to buy things like weapons, specific perks like quick revives, opening doors, and activating traps. But not only that, the level is also teeming with some hidden goodies like finding media fragments to unlock a secret song, and using a teleporter to gain access to a secret room. I mean, hell, the Zombies mode even has a running storyline all throughout the Treyarch-developed Call of Duty games. What the story is, I'll have to tell you another day, since this review was probably long enough as it is, but who knows, maybe at some stage I'll give the Zombies mode a more comprehensive mini-review around Halloween one of these years. Over to the technical aspects, Call of Duty Black Ops still looks pretty stellar 7 years on. And while many lambast the Call of Duty series for being nothing more than grey-brown military shooters with little artistic flair, I do think that Black Ops does present some pretty authentic locations to make up for that fact. Whether it be the cane fields of Cuba, or the snow-buried mountains of Russia, or even the underwater segment beneath the Rusalka, Black Ops does have its occasional moments of beauty in a game that mostly just knuckles down with grungy war-torn environments, which makes for some pretty decent contrast. As far as the soundtrack is concerned, Sean Murray's compositions are fantastic. The score itself provides a chilling atmosphere between thumping military music and ambient industrial hums, doing well to suit the psychological atmosphere of Mason's fragmented mind, while also perfectly suiting the atmosphere of the Cold War. But the one thing I do love about the soundtrack is when it decides to rock out. Whether it be Mr. Shades putting on his sunglasses or during the fight in the MacV compound, the metal tracks are always something I enjoy listening to while blasting through enemies. However, special mention to the soundtrack I feel also must go to the Zombies soundtrack. This one, compared to the main story, has a bigger emphasis on the metal and techno side of things, but I do have to give massive kudos to Kevin Sherwood for his fantastic compositions, and Elena Siegman for her beautiful voice on some tracks.
Seriously, dudes, you are fantastic.
In terms of voice acting, Black Ops has a surprisingly star-studded cast featuring big names like Sam Worthington as Alex Mason, Gary Oldman as Victor Reznov, and Ed Harris as Mr. Shades, alongside Ice Cube as Bowman. All of them are pretty top-notch in their roles, and I have no real complaints about their performances. Although, there is the odd occasion where Sam Worthington does dip into his Australian accent every now and again.
You fucking son of a bitch!
Reznov, I'm gonna fucking kill Dragovich and then bite his fucking cock off, you fucking cunt!
And with that bit of vulgarity out of the way, what are my final thoughts on Summon of Responsibility Darkness Operations?
While my opinions on the Call of Duty series beforehand were mostly just a passing indifference on its take on war, Call of Duty Black Ops changed the way I perceived the series. Now, granted, I'm not going to say that all the Call of Duty games are of this quality, but where I feel Black Ops succeeds is in its story and its period setting, with the Cold War detailing some of the conflicts that went on during the 60s. Combine that with some psychological elements, solid gameplay, and overall, I think we have a game that, even for people who lambast the franchise as being nothing more than a shallow shooter for the 12-year-old kiddywinks, it's still the kind of game that I feel might just shatter some of those negative expectations to some degree. That and the Zombies mode is fantastic.
So on that note, I'm Skully, keeping new metal, and next time on Skully Reviews, be prepared for hell. Catch you later.
9,